Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that you don't require a £25,600 salary to enter. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. How are you? I'm full of pancakes.
I am equally full of pancakes. I've been on a bit of a diet, but today I got to the lowest point weight-wise in 6 months, so why not eat several pancakes? But also I did vaguely healthy pancakes in that I didn't have like lashings of golden syrup or sugar. I had like fruit and mascarpone, which is a bit more healthy, but like it's not that healthy. It's just compared to how healthy I've been being, it seems extremely unhealthy, but it's less. It's better than just covering myself in sugar, I guess.
That sounds fair. Hey, maybe some people do. The internet is a wide place.
Patreon bonus. So yes, anyway, moving swiftly on, we're going to head into the intro and headlines. So a number of things have happened. Last time we were dealing with America, and so we were like, oh, let's have a break from Brexit. Let's not worry about our politics too much. But with the inevitability of the like tide of news that we've been having, things have happened. And so I think we're going to start off with a discussion of Priti Patel, who is our Home Secretary, has had rather a rough week, hasn't she?
Yes, she has. And I can confirm that she is the Home Secretary. Yeah, I've been doubting myself for a second there. Yeah, so she's had a pretty rough week. I've picked up two headlines that sort of show the two sides of the coin here. So
that first headline from The Eye, immigration backlash over British carers. Not careers, carers. I read that correctly.
Congratulations. This is the news that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has introduced, has proposed like tough new measures against immigrants coming into the country once we leave December 31st this year. That's when the new immigration targets would come in. A lot was made during the general election about the possibility of having a points-based immigration system, and this is what the government appears to have adopted. Some of the criteria that they've got, they basically need to have a job offer from an improved employer at an appropriate skill level. Make of that what you will, what you need to be an improved employer or what you have to have appropriate skill. They also have to speak English. That gets you about 50 points, but you must have 70 points to be eligible for a visa. So you can get that extra 20 points in a number of different ways. So you could have a relevant PhD in your area of expertise. You could be working in area that's desperate for employment, so it would be seen as a specialist occupation. So they might bump that to make it 70 points, but it does seem like quite a high criteria to pass. Another point that can get you 10 points, I believe, is a salary of over £25,600. That's yearly, which does seem quite high, particularly when you're looking at a lot of the jobs that immigrants tend to do at the time. So
maybe for some numbers, I had a quick look, and the average full-time salary for employees in the UK in 2018 to 2019 was just over £30,000. So it's still below the average, because I imagine that's a bell curve. It will be kind of in that kind of chunk below the median of UK salaries. But it's still more than a lot of people earn in a graduate job, which I think is probably what most people have raised.
Yeah, precisely. And there's lots of there's a number of jobs where there's like a challenge for companies that need lower skilled workers. Lower skilled being the term that the government has applied to this. You can have a big debate about how much skill it takes to do these jobs. So, for example, social care is the big one that people are seeing as a problem. It's not currently listed as a shortage occupation, but as the BBC points out, you've got 1 in every 11 posts is currently unfulfilled in the social care sector, and it's a sector that's likely to keep on growing as we have an aging population. It's a job that is pretty low paid, I believe. That's just my personal opinion, for the type of work that you have to do. And if suddenly we lose a big influx of people coming into the country who are willing to do that work, then there's going to be a big problem and a big shortage. Yeah, if you get a shortage in that particular area, that's going to cause a crisis in social care and affect the elderly and the most vulnerable, those who need care the most. It's going to have quite a negative impact there. You also have the NHS that relies on like a smooth supply of foreign workers. Currently, foreign nationals make up about 13% of the workforce. And I know personally from working within an NHS trust that we do rely on foreign doctors and nurses in particular to come here and treat people. Now, some doctors may come over that salary threshold, but they still might not meet the other criteria, and this is where it starts to fall down. Maybe the biggest problem has been that the government has said that these plans aim to free up about 8.5 million workers that are not currently in employment in the UK. Now, this is an odd figure, 8.5, because the government in their unemployment figures will tell you that 1.5 million people are unemployed. So where have the extra 7 million come from?
So I think we've discussed this before, haven't we? That unemployment numbers, I think there's an episode of More or Less Behind the Stats, the BBC show that went into this, but about, I think it was 5 years ago, we changed like the definition of unemployed. You could be on a 0-hour contract and therefore legally, or therefore technically you're unemployed, even if you don't get given any hours by your employer. And there's a number of other things that count, which most people would not consider being fully employed because they're not a full-time job.
Yeah.
Which is probably where this difference in the figures has come about.
Yes, and the BBC even pointed out that a lot of those 8.5 include people who are full-time students, the retired, and people who may be full-time carers but not paid for that. So they might care for a relative or loved one, but not be classed officially as employed. And it's this juxtaposition that may cause problems for the government further down the road. Now, it appears the government seems unfazed by these claims. Even Priti Patel herself was unfazed when a journalist pointed out that her own parents wouldn't have been able to come into the country if they enforced this immigration system. And I think the same would be said of Sajid Javid, who made a big point during his leadership election that he was the son of a bus driver and that he'd sort of worked himself up from quite very humble roots to becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, or, well, more on that story later, I guess. So even the implementation of this quite strict immigration policy could go against some core conservative values of the ability to, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and make the most out of whatever you've got. It's about making sure everybody has that equal opportunity to achieve greatness. That's what conservatism tends to be on. So I think the main reason they've gone with this policy, personally, is because it is a headline grabber. It's something that those on the more Brexiteer side have been pushing for. And secondly, the government's always said wanted to limit immigration. The previous governments of Blair, Brown, May and Cameron have said that they would put a cap on immigration, and multiple times that cap has been ignored or not enforced because necessity required that, we needed people to work for the NHS. It remains to be seen how strictly these rules will be applied, or if it's just a headline grabber for now to get people talking and to make people think that they've lived up to their promise. But the real proof will be if immigration numbers are affected or go down. I assume that's what they want to happen. If they have a much stricter immigration policy, they do want to reduce the amount of immigration, but we won't see that for some time. And a lot of that might be dependent on what happens in Brexit trade talks. I imagine a no-deal Brexit will probably deter people from coming to the UK for very different economic reasons, rather than the strict immigration policy that we've decided to inflict upon ourselves.
I just want to add in some more numbers I looked up and threw into the chat while you were talking about that. So I wouldn't. So we said there's this minimum salary, but also then you could be in a special job. I think it's probably quite telling that both the average salary for a registered nurse in the UK and the starting salary for a qualified teacher are both below that threshold at the moment. So it's kind of like, there's been a lot of stuff going on over the last few years about should public sector workers be paid more. I mean, answer probably yes, but they've been getting very small pay rises, not in line with inflation, etc. So by having that clause in there, they can be like, oh, well, we're still hiring nurses, while paying them less than that threshold that they have actually set. But yeah, I think it remains to be seen how it is, as you say, how it is enforced. Whether this, I think you can get into this problem where it's used to kind of cherry pick, and it kind of is inherently cherry picking because we're asking for people to have PhDs, etc., to come in for jobs where you might not normally require a PhD, but you could see a problem where it's not fully enforced, but it's enforced when we want to, and stuff like that. And that could get very messy very fast, I feel.
Yeah, certainly.
So next up, I think we have a story, as we said, it's been a rough week for Priti Patel. And so this headline is in the Times. Patel livid after claim she has lost trust of MI5.
Yeah, so after all these immigration, the immigration policy came out, a lot of focus has been on Priti Patel as a spokesperson for the government, and I don't think it's unfair to say that her persona that she portrays is seen as quite combative. She's always got that, I think she's known for that smirk that she's got on, which is kind of a natural tick, even though I believe she got told off by Andrew Marr on the show that she was smirking whilst he was saying some quite drab unemployment and poverty figures at her. He later apologized for saying that she was smirking because that's just her resting face. But there's a lot of this persona that she portrays, that she's quite combative and quite in your face, seems to be making its way down to her own civil servants that she runs. She seems to have come to at loggerheads with the main civil service at the Home Office, and 2 people have already stepped down under her leadership. And it appeared that more people were starting to complain about her and had allegations of bullying that can be quite serious. Now, one article in the Mail, it's just a clash of management styles, that she's not a bully, she's just direct, and that, sometimes when it comes to, when you work with a civil servant and a minister, instead of having a yes man who just agrees with everything she says, it might be better to have a style where policies go through some scrutiny, as the positives and negatives of it are discussed in a rigorous manner. However, some people seem to think that Priti Patel has gone too far, and this is leading to quite a lot of tension within the Home Office department, a department that is spotlight at the moment because of these new immigration laws. On top of that, there were claims in the Sunday papers that MI5 didn't trust Priti Patel, and that they were giving her sort of reduced intelligence briefs on what actually was going on. We've heard this sort of story before across the pond, where they say that, the FBI or the CIA is holding back information from President Trump because they're afraid he would leak it to Russia, or that's the perceived, that's what they perceive that as. Priti Patel, of course, had a scandal back in 2017 where she was seen having an unauthorized meeting with Israeli officials that eventually got her sacked from her position as then, what was she at the time? I'm trying to remember what position she was in. I think she might have been International Trade Secretary at the time. But it's a big sort of no-no in the Ministerial Code of Conduct. You can't have meetings that aren't prior knowledge of Cabinet. And going behind their back like that broke a lot of trust. And as a result, she was dismissed from May's government. Now, to have somebody who's already sort of misled Cabinet before become Home Secretary, you might see that MI5 might have some justified reason to not trust her entirely. However, she's rebutted these claims quite firmly. But it just shows that it's been a hectic week for her, and it's certainly one that's put her under the spotlight, and her competence has been questioned at every turn. And I think she is... I think she's very loyal to Boris and the project, so I don't think that she's going anywhere soon. But if she has a slip-up on the scale of what she did back in 2017, then I'm afraid Boris Johnson will have no alternative but to fire her. And,
I mean, you touched on that there, but we were already saying when she got reselected, seems like an odd choice. You'd think someone would be told off for longer, I mean, I feel like if you commit significant misconduct while a minister, there should be an actual formal ban, but there isn't at the moment. So the fact that she's come back so quickly after doing something which, at the time, everyone was like, that's her career over. So the fact that she's come back from it is kind of indicative of how everything's a bit topsy-turvy now with Brexit.
I believe we always used to say like disgraced former Foreign Secretary Liam Fox, didn't we? Or something like that. It was...
so I still have that plugin on Chrome and I often forget because I'll read an article and it'll say, disgraced former Defence Minister Liam Fox. And I'll be
Liam Fox, that's it, yeah.
And I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember I added this. It's like, it's hidden away in my Chrome settings. And so every time I read an article, it automatically changes his name to that. But again, like you shouldn't, I do feel like forgetting these things people have done wrong is bad. So, a reminder is good. And
I think that the point we're going to move on to when we move on to our main story is that sometimes competence as a minister isn't the main deciding factor. Loyalty to your prime minister and to the cause is sometimes seen as a greater asset. And I think you can see in Priti Patel someone who is very dedicated to the cause. I didn't want to bring this up, but I'm briefly going to touch on it. There was a photo of her going around holding up, like they had the Savage Avid one holding up the 50p, stylized close to the camera. There's one of her holding up the new passport.
Yes. I think I saw that because the reason it was shown to me was people complaining about the French words on the British passport, which of course are the motto of the royal family. Some irony lost there, I feel. I'll see if I can find that link to throw into the show notes, though.
But the passport's black, isn't it? Like, I swear we've been talking about blue passports for what seems like 1 million years since Brexit was starting to happen. And now I've seen it. And it looks black, and I feel like I'm losing my mind.
So they describe it as blue, but it's like the darkest shade of navy I've seen. In the photo, so Priti Patel actually has black hair, so by comparison, it is a lighter shade than her hair, but not by much. Yeah. It also says, give me a second, I'm going to go get my actual passport to compare. It's only a few meters away.
But I'm just thinking... It was a pointless argument to begin with, and now I'm looking at it, and it seems even more pointless. It seems like we were arguing for the wrong thing.
Yeah, somewhat. I have an old style passport. It's after they introduced the electronic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So my passport is, and I think this has changed a bit because I've seen a few people get one this year before the blue ones came in. Mine says European Union at the top, which is very hard to see. Then it says United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Then it has the crest of the royal family. Then it says passport, and then it has the symbol to show it's an e-passport. The new one says in massive letters at the top, British passport. Then it has the crest of the royal family, coat of arms of the royal family, and then it says United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I will put a photo of mine in the show notes next to Priti Patel's. Let's see if we can do that. Wouldn't that be snazzy?
Yeah. Just open it as well and just show us so we can... Can you put your mother's maiden name in as well and just the last 4 digits of your account number?
You know what? I can't do it because my screen is backlit, but I can take a photo of my passport. Just to show you how well used it is.
Oh yeah, you're like an international jet setter.
Yeah, I mean, you should see the pages I have for like Chinese and Japanese visas. It's just like, let's just staple this in. Oh, good. Cool. Thanks.
I make it out of the village sometimes, following the tractor. One day I made it all the way to Nep Thrubwell. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is a fake passport. You just haven't... Have you sanded that? That's incredible.
No, it's just been in my pocket many times. But yes. Okay, so we're going to move on from passports. I want to throw one bit of extra news in before we move on to our main story. I might not keep this in. I just want your opinion on this. Mm-hmm. Have you seen? This hasn't got a headline associated with it. I've seen a few like floating around, but have you seen the current exchange rate between the pound and the euro?
Oh no, do tell.
So I was pleasantly surprised when I was coming back from France the other day to drop about 55 euros on something, and it came out as under 50 quid, which was a bit surprising. So I went shopping at Carrefour before I came back. And so currently £1 is worth 1.18 euros, which is not back up to pre-2016 levels, but is the healthiest it's been in quite a while, because we got to the point where it was basically, I think it was May time last year when we went over to Dublin, and it was almost 1-to-1. I think I ended up paying, because I ended up having to go to like the travel money place at the airport to get additional euros. Those euros I was paying like £1 something per euro, because they obviously charge extra fees and stuff at the airport. So like it got to that point last year, and now it's kind of stabilized. And do you have any thoughts about that? Do you have any insight on that? Or is it just this was kind of inevitable now that things have slightly stabilized and we've actually said what we're going to do?
I think your point there is exactly right, that now we've stabilized. Now there at least is some sort of clear plan for the next 6 months. We're not going to, if you remember when we were in a position where we kept having to extend the transition period by 3 months every time, or 6 months, then it became awkward and everybody was like, oh, what are we going to do the next time? Now there's a strong, there's a government that it's very clear with the EU who they have to negotiate with now, and they know that any Brexit deal is passed in the, will go through UK Parliament smoothly. I think that has helped to strengthen the pound. However, there are a lot of other economic forces at play at the moment. I know that because of the coronavirus outbreak that's going on, stock markets are sliding as people worry about the economic impact of that, and that's had a big impact on the main sort of markets today. The stock exchanges have all gone down quite a bit. So I don't know how currency will be affected by that, but I assume that currency isn't unaffected. But yeah, I think your broader point of stability for at least the next 6 months means that it's probably better for the pound versus the euro in the short term.
Yeah, and I don't know how much this affects this when you're doing the maths of how coronavirus will affect things, but we are an island. Even though people can fly in and out, that might factor into people's thoughts about it. I don't think it offers us much protection in reality, but it might be a thing for people factor in when they're making decisions. I don't know.
Yeah, no. Having played Pandemic, I think the place you've really got to invest in is Madagascar and
yes, Madagascar is the place to be,
and Greenland. I think both of those are pretty good.
Yeah, freeze the virus before it gets to you. Okay, so we're going to move on to our main story tonight. So we're going to talk in general first about cabinet reshuffles before moving on into our recent cabinet reshuffle. For people, I mean, we're going to describe what cabinet reshuffle is and why they happen, but I suppose if you haven't really been following politics much, you might have heard of the Night of the Long Knives. That's, I think, an example that stands out that I knew about before I personally started kind of following politics. It was just a thing that got bandied around. Do you have any other examples you're going to fill us in with, Rob?
Yeah, a few. So the Night of the Long Knives example you talk about is copied the name from the 1933 one from Adolf Hitler, which is so the one done in the British cabinet was done by Macmillan and wasn't as brutal as Hitler as you would imagine, but in the 1933 version was the one where Hitler took power off the SA, the militant wing of the Nazi party, and basically literally stabbed people in the back and had people arrested so he could consolidate his power. The Light of the Long Knives was Macmillan's government, where he essentially threw out 7 massive cabinet positions. We're talking like Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor, all in one big reshuffle in an attempt to try and regain power. It didn't work. He lost the next election. But it shows that people can go to desperate measures during cabinet reshuffles, and they tell you a lot about the philosophy in government at the time, and they can often be reactive to recent events. So the examples that stand out in my head are Blair in 2006. Labour had just come off some disastrous local election results, and the government of the time needs to be seen to be doing something. And the easiest thing you can do is you can control the people that you're in charge of. So he had a massive shuffle in back in 2006. Cameron as well in 2015. That was just after the elections that the Conservatives hadn't expected to win, and they had previously had a lot of Lib Dems in their party taking up important cabinet positions. For example, you had Nick Clegg as Deputy PM, but you had Vince Cable as Business Secretary. Like, they weren't all shoved to the sidelines. Suddenly, in 2015, the Conservatives have all the power, so he can shove all the Lib Dems out and start really showing you what he would do under a true Conservative government. So they are important, and and they always help to. It's the best way of showing what a prime minister is thinking at the time. I think it's a real true reflection of the aims of their government, because this is one of the few points that they literally have all the power over. You're not going to have anybody else interfering. We can maybe discuss how a prime minister's special advisor might try and influence proceedings, because that's been talked about a lot during this reshuffle. But in essence, it should be the prime minister who has all the power to hire and fire at will and make sure that he's got a team behind him who supports them through thick and thin. A lot of this can also depend on... So I've talked about how it's a PM's power at stake. A lot can be reflective of the strength of the PM too. Do they have a big majority or not? Are all the factions under control? So, for example, back in 2006, Blair's had a bad result in the local elections, and a lot of people still blamed Blair for the Iraq war. So the response to that was, hey, maybe let's bring a few more Brownites into cabinet, strengthen their faction to try and make sure that people see, to try and keep old Labour people on board, to say, no, we are still the party that we were in 1997. And balance it out that way. Theresa May, for example, after the 2017 election, had a huge job to try and balance jobs between Brexiteers and Remainers. If one faction had too much power, I think if Theresa May had gone in with a full cabinet of Remainers, she would have had a lot more noise from the backbenches and from Brexiteers saying that this wasn't her Brexit. I mean, as we know, what happened in the events of 2019 and 2018 sort of showed us that the Brexiteers still weren't silent, despite having members within the cabinet. And maybe one reason for that is that the cabinet ministers used their own power to leave May's government early on. So Boris Johnson, I believe, resigned. David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, and Raab resigned in their position as Brexit secretary, and that undermines the PM's position. If she's not able to hire people from certain factions, that's how cabinet ministers can bite back. But in essence, Theresa May was trying to keep a balance when she had very little wiggle room.
So you mentioned what a reshuffle does and when they tend to happen, but when can the PM call one? I mean, obviously, it would be foolish for him to call one every day, but is there any limit?
There's no sort of set term limit. He doesn't have to. He could keep with the same cabinet for the whole 5 years of government if he so wished. Maybe the one point where you're definitely having a cabinet reshuffle is when a new leader is elected. So we saw one once Boris took over, even though there wasn't a general election, he came in and said, right, this is who I'm picking for my team. And this is the first one that's happened after the general election, which is another good time to do it. You can reflect on the strengths and weaknesses in your party. Boris is obviously coming in quite a strong position. He got a strong majority from Parliament. He was able to push his Brexit deal through. So in his eyes, Brexit is done, inverted commas around the microphone. So with all of that in place, we're now left with a lot of questions. Does he really need the support of the ERG, those old European Research Group members? Could he just ditch them and say, we've done Brexit, we don't need you, I can actually bring in my more moderate friends, Boris pre-Brexit, before...
Yeah, because as we've discussed before, Boris has kind of flip-flopped, I mean, to the point where he wrote a letter for and against Brexit before the actual referendum, and he's also as you say, he would have appeared to be someone who wanted Brexit to happen, but we would have gone with he wanted a deal. It was quite moderate originally, but then he's kind of ended up with the flag waver for this quite hard Brexit.
Or the other option he has is to say, we ditch all the Remainers. The Remainers lost. That's what, the 2019 election was all about, the defeat of the Remain side of the party. I'm going to double down, have all my Brexiteers in here, and let's negotiate our Brexit deal in a year. I think after he's got that deal through, that would be another turning point for him to stop, reassess, see if he wants to reshuffle his cabinet again. So they tend to follow big events within government or key elections, like local elections or a poor performance, and that might be enough to trigger a different way of thinking for the prime ministerial branch of government.
So we're in this position. We're not sure exactly what he's going to do. Here he goes. Post general election, I'm going to have a reshuffle. It's like a throw of the dice. I'm imagining it's like a round in a board game. It's like time for the reshuffle. You said, does he need the support of the ERG, etc.? So who does he get rid of? And did that pan out? Would you say his cabinet is more or less Brexity?
So I'd say he got rid of some more traditional Brexiteers and brought in some of the new guard. So the old Brexiteers that he got rid of, and I don't think this is a great surprise, is he got rid of Andrea Leadsom, Esther McVeigh, and Theresa Villiers. So Andrea Leadsom was obviously the person who ran against Theresa May for the leadership campaign and kind of stuck around in Parliament in one facet or the other, seemingly because she was the last candidate. She was picked by Theresa May to join her government because that's what you tend to do when you've just run against somebody. You're trying to keep the two parts of the party together. May was seen as a Remainer, Leadsom was the Brexiteer, so she gave Leadsom a job. Now, I personally don't think Leadsom was particularly talented as a minister. I think that's why towards the end she was shoved to the side, shoved from like leader to the House to a more junior role, and now appears to be a good time to get rid of her. The same for Esther McVeigh and Theresa Villiers, but they all, when I talk about old Brexiteers, they tend to be the Brexiteers who were focused on, I want to leave more for economic reasons rather than anything to do about immigration. They're the softer Brexiteers, if you get what I mean. The ones that would have still supported Boris and still wanted the deal, still wanted to, not have a second referendum on this matter, but might not be willing to go as far as the new Conservative Party appears to want to go to. So those are the three I've picked out as the big names that you may have heard of in the past, but now have been officially sidelined by the government. And to be honest, nobody was particularly surprised that Boris chose to get rid of them.
So with that in mind, that those are the people who he's got rid of, I kind of came in like halfway through the news on the reshuffle, because I think it's one of those stories where they say, oh, Cabinet Reshuffle's happening in the morning, and you start getting all those photos of people going into number 10 on the BBC. And I think I kind of seen that in passing, but I was either busy with work or driving for work, so I hadn't had a proper chance. And then so we started off with some kind of normal appointments, people we were expecting to go to number 10. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think Boris had even said before that this was meant to be a minor reshuffle, just one that was meant to calm everything down, have a bit of his stamp, get rid of some of those, like I said, people who were useful to him before he got Brexit done, people he needed on his side, and now he's got an 80 majority, a huge majority in Parliament. He can afford to get rid of them. Leadsom or Esther McVeigh isn't suddenly going to lead a huge splinter group against Johnson. He doesn't care about that. And if they did, they wouldn't have much impact. So he's got rid of them. He's got rid of the sole Remainer in Nicky Morgan, who voluntarily stepped down. I think she's in the Lords. Anyway, she was made.
Yes, she was made a Lord.
Or lady, I assume.
Or a lady, yes.
So she was sort of hanging in cabinet by that way, but said that she would step down, and that surprised nobody. She was one of the few Remainer voices in the cabinet, one of the ones that seemed important to get the deal through before the election. After the election, she really wasn't needed anymore. Then we get on to, I've kind of picked out three big ones, like big changes that I think will have a big impact on the way the government is run compared to when Boris Johnson had his previous cabinet. So the first one was Geoffrey Cox as Attorney General. Now, I don't know if you remember him. He was quite a prominent figure when we had all the Brexit stuff happening on our telly every other night. He was the one with the big booming voice.
I know what he looks like, but then again, I've been following things quite closely. I think his time in the sun has been, in political terms, kind of blink and you'll miss it. You might not know who he is.
He was, as Attorney General for Theresa May, he had been forced into a fair number of embarrassing climb downs for the government. There was the time when Theresa May's government was seen as being in contempt of Parliament because they refused to bring the Brexit bill back within a certain time frame. They were seen as ignoring it. Also, under Johnson's time in government, before the election, he was forced to talk about the reason why Parliament was forced to reconvene to talk about Brexit because they'd lost the High Court case. And in quite a controversial move, I think he said that the Parliament that was before him was a dead Parliament. It was a zombie Parliament. And he coined that phrase, saying that, this group of people who assembled there had no power and they were just keeping the country locked in this permanent position of indecision. So he's gone, but I don't think it's because of his previous performance. It's because he's said himself in his resignation letter that he was an independent figure and always willing to speak out in cabinet and speak his mind, and particularly when you're Attorney General and you're going to be dealing with matters of law, and that means going over exactly what's part of the European deal and making sure that it legally matches up with what we want. He might have some limitations on Boris Johnson's plans. He might want to speak truth to power in a way that the Boris Johnson government under Dominic Cummings as well doesn't seem to appreciate. So I think that it's no surprise that he's gone. He was a Brexiteer himself. He was a notable figure under May, but he had no particular loyalty to Johnson. And for that reason, I think it was everybody understood why he was one of the first casualties in the reshuffle.
So his replacement is someone I hadn't heard of before, but I've looked her up. So he's been replaced by Suella Braverman, and so I mean, the good is that she was previously a lawyer. I don't know if there is, any actual requirement for the Attorney General, but one that they tend to be people who have been lawyers before they were made MPs. So it's, she has experience being a lawyer. That's obviously a good sign for the Attorney General. And then, but she, on the bad side, she was previously chairman of the ERG. So after that whole discussion we just had, seems like someone who's quite an arch Brexiteer who's come in. From our point of view, as people who aren't massive fans of Brexit,
Yeah, she is. She preceded Jacob Rees-Mogg as the head of the ERG. And as her politics go, she's very she's very anti-human rights, or sees the Human Rights Bill as passed by the European Court of Justice as one that she doesn't agree with and wants to replace quite urgently. She's written articles on the fact that she wants to go to war against them, and it was the one replacement that I saw on Twitter with everybody going, "Oh my God, Suella Braverman, really?" Talking from people like the secret barrister or people who were lawyers themselves going, "Oh my goodness, we've had to sit through select committees with this person, and I really didn't like the way that, she didn't listen to us one bit when we gave our view on what the law was." She might be her views are very tempered by ideology as well. Appeared to be the opinion that was put forward on Twitter. I've never met her. I can only just say what people have said, which is kind of, worrying in a sense. You'd hope that the Attorney General is meant to uphold the letter of the law. But as we know, this government under Johnson, and particularly under Cummings has made it no secret that he wants to try and limit the power of the courts to say what the government can do. Johnson, as we mentioned very recently, had to open up Parliament on the request of the court because the government was seen to be breaking the law, essentially. Cummings doesn't want that embarrassment to happen to the government again, and is kind of seeking to, in my opinion, upset the balance of power. We have many checks and balances on power, and one of those is that, the government can make legislation, but it is within the power of the courts to say if that legislation is legal and doesn't go against any other statute law. To try and take away the court's power in that matter might lead to, is a potential slippery slope to a government with potentially unlimited power. And that's something I don't think anybody wants with whoever's in power, really. You always want to make sure that somebody is keeping us on the straight and narrow. So,
no, I don't want an image of Boris Johnson sat down saying, "I am the Senate." So
Precisely. So that's why her appointment is slightly a worry. She's seen as like relatively inexperienced and ultimately somebody who will just parrot what both Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings want to the letter. So that's our first one, and that's the reason many people have concerns over that little shuffle in government.
So next up, this one was kind of a surprise to me, and I think you'll touch on that, but someone who was quite successful in their position, and you're like, oh, well, you'd think someone who has done well and not really made headlines for anything else would continue in their role. So why have we lost our Northern Ireland Secretary, Julian Smith?
Yeah, for a number of reasons, really. Mostly because he was seen as a critic of Boris Johnson is the reason why he's left. It appears that Johnson had a bit of a grudge against Julian Smith for the way that Smith had spoken out on Northern Ireland issues. Now, we've touched a lot on this podcast in the past about how Northern Ireland is kind of a big problem for Brexit and Brexiteers. It's the only part of the UK that shares a land border with a EU country, so the way that border is managed is kind of still up in the air, and any suggested solution by the government appears incredibly complicated, or at least not thought out to the nth degree. And Julian Smith had quite rightly pointed out that he had some concerns about the way the government was dealing with Northern Ireland. It could also be possible that Smith had been supporting legislation in Northern Ireland to pursue those who had been involved in historical crimes during the times of the Troubles. A lot of Tory backbenchers just didn't want to pursue this. They didn't want to open up an old can of worms, and they thought it might cause more harm than good, particularly those who were like on the English side perspective. However, those within Northern Ireland on both sides of the Troubles do think that it was important to make sure that those who, took part in the awful crimes that happened at that time have some justice given to those families. So that was just another small little point where they rubbed and they got, they disagreed. Julian Smith was, like you said, ultimately seen as quite a successful Northern Ireland secretary, mainly because he'd been able to secure a return to power sharing within Stormont. They'd had a deadlock within Northern Ireland for years where their parliament simply refused to meet in any way because one was seen to have an advantage over the other. Now, Julian Smith's actual influence over this, if you're looking at it from a Johnson perspective, you can debate how much this was down to Julian Smith or how much it was down to circumstance. So one big part is that Julian Smith took over as Northern Ireland Secretary at a time when the Conservatives no longer needed the support of the DUP. So now you've got Sinn Féin looking at this and going, oh, okay, now you don't have to give that extra money to the DUP so they can keep in power there. Maybe we can start talking on a more even keel about this subject. Secondly, both the DUP and Sinn Féin had come off the back of some quite unfavourable election results in 2019 that seemed to suggest people were punishing the two parties for not being able to come to an agreement. So they had that extra catalyst behind them to say, oh no, we really should sort this out because at the next election, we may lose power to a third party. So Julian Smith was certainly quite a lucky Northern Ireland secretary in that manner, but he appears to have been well liked in Northern Ireland and by the people who matter, those in power. And when you've got a situation like Brexit on the horizon in less than a year, and you've got a very complex political situation in Northern Ireland and a very complex history, it's always important that you have a skilled minister there who can really understand the people, the politics, the history, everything that's gone into that area over the past 100 years almost. You've got to balance all that culture up and make sure that when you're Northern Ireland Secretary, you really are representing Northern Ireland. You can't just fob it off and go, there are other cabinet positions that might seem like less weighty. Northern Ireland is one where you really need to know your stuff. So to lose somebody who had the support of both sides in both the DUP and Sinn Féin is a big gamble by Johnson. And the reason it shocked people, or the main reason it framed a lot of this cabinet debate, is that it was seen that Johnson valued loyalty over skill more, I feel, in this case. And that's the biggest worry.
And especially if that's a general trend of replacing people repeatedly who are loyal as opposed to doing a good job, it becomes a bit like the kind of Trumpian White House that we've seen, which I think is not something we want to emulate.
Yeah, certainly. And again, it's another removal of a check and balance on the power of the PM. We've talked about him removing the check and balance away from the judges. If cabinet feels like it's unable to speak its mind or question Johnson when he has a certain idea that might not work for a certain department, that's going to be a worry that the government never has any scrutiny at all, even within its own party.
So finally, we come to the shock, the reason I suddenly tuned in after seeing, the usual photos of people walking into number 10 waving. I'll leave the suspense in your hands. Who was it who suddenly went when none of us were expecting him to?
So it's our main man, Sajid Javid, the Chancellor, who, by all accounts, at the start of the day, most people thought his job was pretty safe, mostly because he had a budget to write in about 2 weeks' time. And he was seen as one of the sort of success stories, I guess, of the Conservative Party. Although he didn't win the leadership election, he was clearly well liked, and he was seen as very competent in his role. He hadn't been Chancellor for very long, to be fair, but within the halls of within Whitehall and within the Westminster, he was well respected and well liked. He wasn't another Christopher Grayling, where everybody thought was mumbling, "Oh, he's failed at every job he's had." Javid was, seen as the real deal. So he walks into number 10, expected to be told that he can keep his job, and he said that he can keep it as long as he abides by one condition, that he sacks all of his special advisors and takes on the team that Johnson and Dominic Cummings want him to take. He said no, and as a result, resigned from his job. Now, I think that reflects quite well on him. I don't think any self-respecting minister could agree to those terms, not one who's already in power, because it shows that he would be giving up an awful lot of his power over to Johnson and Cummings. And essentially, if he loses all his special advisors, then maybe he felt that he wasn't getting the independent scrutiny he would rely on to make the best financial decisions for the country.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I haven't necessarily agreed with Javid on a lot of things, that, but I think we have both generally were like. I think if you look back through our past episodes, we have both kind of generally been like, he seems like a reasonable person to put in this position, even if we don't necessarily agree with all of his stances. And, the fact that he had the backbone to do that does seem to be, kind of filling in that kind of theory we had about him, that he was kind of a reasonable middle of the road conservative, and not, he was a bit Brexity, which we weren't particularly fans of when he was first put there. But like a lot of the stuff he's done has not been he's felt like a relatively safe pair of hands.
Yeah, he's competent. Like, he's a minister who you
exactly
think,
that's
yes,
it. Yeah.
I trust him to at least do his job well, even if I don't agree with every one of his decisions. And it's a big move in another way, because the position of Prime Minister and Chancellor have traditionally been very separate. It is the job of the Chancellor to tell the Prime Minister no, sorry, we haven't got the money for that right now. Choose another thing to spend it on. His hand had already been forced over HS2. He had to find the money for that. And to deliver some of Johnson's promises from the general election, he would need to find money, a lot more money elsewhere. And he had the quite uncomfortable task of saying, no, we can't have it unless you A, raise taxes, which they're not going to do, or 2, borrow a lot more money. At the moment, interest rates are about as low as they can be. So he doesn't have the luxury of lowering those once again. His only option would be to borrow more money. And as a responsible chancellor, in his eyes, he didn't feel ready that, he didn't feel the country was ready to take that on. Now Johnson was able to get rid of him and replace him with his deputy, Rishi Sunak, who was relatively unknown, a fairly inexperienced, unknown junior minister suddenly shooting up to the position of chancellor. One, I'm sure Rishi wouldn't turn down that opportunity. It is, to rise to one of the highest ministerial points of the land is a massive boon for your career, and if you get the chance, why would you turn it away? It looks like a bit of a poison chalice, but I think it would be a decision he would regret if he walked away from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thoughts were, I don't know much about him. I had to suddenly look up who he was because, as you say, he's fairly junior. You'd like to think that, he could be perfectly competent. We don't know at this point because he's not had such responsibility before. But the problem is that if Boris Johnson has been the kingmaker in this situation for him, then, of course he's going to have possibly more allegiance to Johnson than someone who's willing to stand up to him. And that's where the concern lies.
Yes, I think in the short term at least, he's going to follow Johnson's lead because he's new in that position. Maybe the one saving grace is that he was quite close to Sajid, Sajid Javid. He was, I think there was a picture of both of them going to see Star Wars Episode 9 together on Twitter with the caption, The Master and the Apprentice. So at least he comes from the same school of Javid and was trusted by the previous Chancellor. Also, he's kind of the same old school of Osborne. That's still a very Cameronite faction, and the one that was meant to take over after David Cameron stepped down, but never did because Brexit happened. But that school is kind of one of austerity and not a great amount of public spending. So maybe in his first budget he will bow to Johnson's will, but come the second or third, will he then have the knowledge and the backbone and the economic experience to say, no, I still want to follow this old school way of thinking. We can't spend all the money that you've promised. That's the big question that is yet to be answered. And I certainly think of the things that have been said about him online. There wasn't the sort of horror that I got on Twitter when Suella Braverman got her appointment. There's nobody sort of recoiling and saying, "Oh my goodness, this is bad." But the biggest impact it has, it shows that one of the highest positions of the land, the Chancellor, who was yet another check and balance on the power of the Prime Minister, on how much he spent, has now gone. So this, to sum up, this reshuffle appears to be all about the centralization of power within the Prime Minister's office. He looks to not, he doesn't want to answer to the courts as much as he did. He doesn't really want to answer to devolved institutions as much as he did, maybe when you're looking at Northern Ireland. And he doesn't want to answer to the person who holds the purse strings in the Chancellor. And that leads us to the big, boogeyman of the time, I guess. If it's more power to the Prime Minister, does that also mean more power to Dominic Cummings, the unelected bureaucrat, as I'll call him, in Westminster, who is grabbing a lot of headlines at the moment for the way that he does things and the amount of power he may have. So yeah, that's the big concern. But this was, if we're looking at cabinet reshuffles of reflections of, how a prime minister perceives themselves and how much power they have, I think it's pretty clear that Johnson feels that he has the power to do whatever he wants in this period of time. I guess the next question is, like, once he's done whatever he wants, will people start to bite back? Because you can't burn all your bridges. Blair if you have a look at Blair in 97 and 2001, he had an awful lot of power and kind of stomped over a lot of the Labour factions that would have been against him in the past. A lot of people thought Blair was too right-wing for Labour, but he had so much power, they just couldn't stop him. In the end, it all kind of comes back to bite you. And towards the end of Johnson's political career, he may have caused himself quite a few enemies during this cabinet reshuffle process. Yeah,
I have one final question kind of related to that, and maybe that's to maybe this works well for our American listeners, or maybe it's just an interesting thing to think about. But there's been a lot of talk in all these other US kind of news outlets about how Trump has ripped up the kind of the social norms within US government. So, there are things that the president would not have done just because it was tradition, even though it was not written down as part of the Constitution, that he has changed since coming into office. Do you think this is the kind of start of a slippery slope where Boris is, like you say, Boris has collected power, but is that enough for him to do what he wants to do? And does this mean that the next prime minister, or that, the next non-conservative prime minister is going to have that same amount of power, or does that still very much depend on what their majority looks like?
I think in British politics, it definitely depends on your majority. You can't do what Johnson has done with a tiny majority or in a coalition, because that requires compromise and keeping a lot of your factions on board. This is a luxury that Johnson has simply because he has so much power within the Conservative Party itself. And the election of 2019 helped him a lot in that matter as well. A lot of the more moderate Conservatives stepped aside or stood down and refused to go back to Parliament. The ones that stepped up in their place were more of the ones that Boris wanted to appoint. You don't have your Philip Hammonds anymore. You don't have those sort of moderates in the party as much as you did. So this is an option that Johnson has taken by the horns and run with, if I want to mix my metaphors anymore. But yeah, this is certainly like a once in a term opportunity for Boris to take this power. I think the biggest social norm that he has gone against is the power of the Chancellor. Even when Blair had all his power, Brown was still seen as a very influential figure. And there was a notable split between the Brownites and the Blairites about how the party was run. If Johnson is able to make the position of Chancellor simply that of the Prime Minister's lapdog, then that's a really big change in British politics. I think if that continues on to be a norm, depends on the success of it. If he's able to, suddenly make the economy boom and it's great, then Johnson can say, yeah, it was all down to me, not the Chancellor. That's, everybody should have listened to me in the first place. If it goes wrong, then it's a big risk for Johnson and his credibility, because a lot of people will not blame the Chancellor. They'll blame Boris even more than they would have done before.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose, double-edged sword there. Is it, if you have all the power, and I suppose it's a bit like now that you can't blame the EU for things because we've technically Brexited, what are people going to blame all these problems on? Will it all fall down upon Boris?
Yes. I believe Harry and Meghan are who we're blaming at the moment. I believe that's the official state.
Good. Yeah. The official UK sanctioned person to complain about, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on towards the end of the show, quick polls update. As we mentioned last time, we're going to be looking overseas over the big blue wet thing to the US with our polls updates, because we're not having a general election soon, or at least I hope we're not. So let's have a look at the Democratic primary results over in 538. I will post these into the chat. So we have two kind of ways we can summarize this data at the moment on 538, and that's candidates' chance of winning more than half of the pledged delegates. That means that that person would immediately become the Democratic nominee at the convention because they have at least 50.1% of the vote. Then the alternative is a plurality of pledged delegates. So you could get to the Democratic convention without any one of the candidates having won a clear majority, even if that is 50.1%, whatever it works out as, one delegate over the line. But they could come in with everyone a bit muddied, which with the if the field doesn't narrow, may be the case. And then you'd have a plurality of delegates. So let's go through those. So the chances of winning more than half of pledged delegates. So at the moment, Sanders is on 2 in 5, which is 44% chance. No one is still up there with 42% chance. Biden has dropped to 10% chance. Bloomberg is there with a 4% chance. Warren with 0.3%, and Buttigieg with 0.1%. So that seems like, if we zoom and enhance, which I think we can do on this chart, or maybe not.
Computer enhance. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of TNG.
Yeah, so overall, it's interesting that if you look at this, so Warren has been on a steady downward trend since early on when she was nearer Biden. Sanders has gone up a bit. The chance of no one getting a plurality has gone up quite a bit because Biden dropped kind of massively after Iowa. Bloomberg has kind of had a bit of a blip, which is probably because, he got, I think I sent you the link. He got completely beaten up at the debate that he was in. It was just like there were so many things that piled up one after the other, like his record on women, etc. And all of the pundits I've been listening to have basically been saying the problem is that he's kind of he was mayor of New York at one point, so he's one of these people who is he might be currently mayor of New York. Anyway, mayors of New York, they have to be a kind of tough guy mentality, but when he's up against the other Democratic candidates, that's not playing very well. And then Sanders looking to be in a pretty good position right now on that metric. And Buttigieg has just, if you look at his trend, it's just generally downward. He had a bit of a bump at Iowa, but it's just generally downward. So I think overall, he and Warren are, despite being talked about a lot, look like they're headed out of the race at the moment as well. If we go to plurality of pledged delegates, we have Sanders with a 2 in 3, 68% chance, Biden on 20%, Bloomberg on 10%, Warren on 1%, and Buttigieg on 0.6%. So, what are your feelings on how this has changed? Bearing in mind, take this with a big pinch of salt because Super Tuesday is next Tuesday, and that's going to be the big day, I believe.
Yeah. So I think since the last time we spoke about it, we've seen the rise and fall of Bloomberg. He kind of came into contention as soon as Biden fell away and became this this is an alternative, maybe centrist candidate that people can get behind. And then, as you mentioned, he was absolutely destroyed in that debate that seemed to lose him multiple percentage points across the field from anybody who was thinking he was, any momentum he might have gained was stopped in that instance. I think it was the first Democratic debate that he had qualified for by having enough support. And the moment that he went into one, he got annihilated. So, yes, I don't think he stands much chance in the rest of the race. Biden is hanging on in there. There's a couple of people who think he might win South Carolina, which is the next primary that's coming up on February 29th. He might just sneak Sanders there. If he does, then that might put a slight dent in his momentum. But a lot of people are predicting that Sanders will win Super Tuesday. So at the moment, I think I would stick with the predictions of 538. It is unlikely that Sanders will win an overall majority by the time you get to the convention, but in such a crowded field, and with so many people sort of leaking away delegates early on, it's pretty tough to get to that majority. I don't think there will be one standout candidate that has enough delegates overall to really challenge him once it gets to the conference where they have to confirm who they're going to support. Any attempt to try and remove Sanders from that position would be incredibly controversial. So yeah, I think that's the way it's going to play out at the moment. But yeah, all eyes on Tuesday, March 3rd. That's the Tuesday coming up. The results of that one will really show us just how strong Sanders' support is, or if there is another candidate on the ropes who might be able to challenge him or push him all the way.
So our other poll we're looking at the moment is the chances of Trump winning the general election. So if you go on the 538 website, you can. There's a whole load of polls, but I'm just looking at the chance of someone versus Trump. And again, this is what we said the other day. These are all polls from the middle of February. So the most recent one was from the 19th to 25th, but the others are mid-February, so since our last episode. And in all of those, the people who were put up against Trump, so the worst one is the one that just came out from Ipsos, where Sanders has +7 over Trump, 47 to 40%. But all of the other candidates they've put forward against Trump have come in with well over 17% better than Trump. Trump hanging around the kind of 35% mark, which is what people see as his base. And those are all based off likely voters, not registered voters. And if you look down into the registered voters section, it still doesn't look much better for Trump, though there is one where it seems like one of the other polls where it's like +7, +6. If you go back a bit further, it looks more narrow. It's kind of +1 or +2. And in fact, I think Trump versus Klobuchar and Trump versus Bloomberg would win in that older poll. But that's quite interesting. So I'll throw that into the chat as well.
Those are super interesting. A lot of movement on those to come, particularly once the battle lines are drawn, once we know who's running against who. That will be when people start to get a bit more serious, I think, and start going to another candidate. People might not like Trump very much, but they might go, oh, I prefer him to, like, that kind of political math starts happening. At this stage, you might have the people who are just never Trumps and saying, yeah, I will just vote for the Democrats, whatever. But I still think that those polls are super interesting, considering the kind of pessimism I went into the 2020 elections again, and sort of like respectable political commentators like Andrew Neil saying, Trump needs a massive economic crash if he's going to mess this up. And not get re-elected. Polling figures like that seem to suggest the exact opposite, and that Trump has quite the uphill battle to remain in power.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see, definitely. So I think there's not much else to say. That's our episode for this evening. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, there's a link to our Discord in the show notes, so you can come and listen to us while we record live. And you can find us in all the usual places. So that's facebook.com/unparliamentary language, reddit.com/r/unparliamentary, Instagram and Twitter @unparl podcast. And of course, if you want to support this show and other shows by TTSS Productions, you can go over to patreon.com/TTSS. Some of that money is going towards new logos, which, as I said, I think this episode will have the new logo on it for Unparliamentary Language. The website, tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com, has got the new logo already, and I'm rolling that out over the various podcasts as we go along. Some of them only had minor tweaks, like Dr. Wilco's and How to Many Things. That also reminds me that How to Many Things episode about dinosaurs really does need to come out, because it's been far too long since I edited it. And I think we'll also, there's some moves towards an interesting new logo for Mishmash Mayhem, but there's a reason why it's not happening immediately, which will be something you can find out over on their podcast. So yeah, check out some of our other shows. And I think the only thing left for me to say is it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
This is the bit where there is no Rob. Rob said to take a call, so I'm just going to fill in a bit here. One question I know I've had from one of our listeners was, does Trump need to get selected as the Republican Party candidate? And the answer is yes. Yes, he does. Currently, at this state in the Republican primaries, he has 86 delegates. and then there's a person called Weld with 1 and Walsh with 0. I'm not enough, I don't know enough about US politics to tell you why these people would bother running against Trump, because essentially it's a shoo-in. He will definitely win because he's the current president. But I don't know if people are running against him because it's worth, maybe it's to get their profile up in time. So in 4 years' time, they can be the presidential candidate. I'm not 100% sure on that, but maybe it's something we can cover in our next episode, because I imagine we're going to have to deal with Super Tuesday and stuff like that. So just a little tidbit for you, I suppose. Hopefully we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming when Rob gets off the phone.
Oh, yeah. That is interesting. It is it's weird seeing his numbers there. Yeah, I don't think an incumbent has ever... Has an incumbent ever... I think Gerald Ford failed to get nominated, standing as an incumbent. He didn't run against... did he run against Carter? I don't think he did run against Carter. Oh, he was pushed very close, I remember. Usually there's a huge incumbency advantage that you have as being president. But yeah. Anyway, cool.
Okie doke. Right. Let me shift this all around because Discord can go over there now. I've got an extra monitor. I feel like some kind of powerful god with my 4K monitor and my 1080p monitor over there. It's great, yeah.
It's nice. From coming from a working environment where I have 3 monitors, going back to 1, I feel like such a scrub.